I'm delighted that we're holding this webinar today, as it is extremely pertinent given our current situation, and it will continue to be more so as we go forward. My name is Nuzhat. I'm the National Lead for Musculoskeletal Health at Public Health England. And today's webinar, before we start, there are some housekeeping rules that the instructions are on slide 2 of the pack. So if I can ask everyone to keep their Skype and their phones on mute. This webinar will be recorded and it will be uploaded on our Musculoskeletal Knowledge Hub. This is an interactive session and questions can be asked via the Skype messaging system throughout the webinar. Please note that everyone can see your questions, so if you have specific questions that you would like to ask separately, you may email those into the K-Hub. We will aim to answer your questions after the presentations, and hopefully we will post the Q&A for the presentations and on the recording on the K-Hub after the webinar. So the outline of the session today is we have some brilliant speakers. We've got Dr. Brendan Stubbs, who is clinical lecturer at King's College London and is head of physiotherapy at South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. Brendan will be sharing some of the research that he has undertaken with colleagues within the UK and internationally, highlighting and raising to the fore the evidence of the connection between musculoskeletal health and mental health. Louis Allwood from the Centre for Mental Health, who is the Policy and Public Affairs Lead, will be sharing with us the work that they have done recently and pre-COVID in terms of the support to promote good musculoskeletal and physical health. And mental health, sorry. And we have Laura Boothman, who is the Senior Policy Manager at Versus Arthritis, and she will be sharing with us some of the work that they've recently done in terms of hearing from patients and the population and what they're telling us around their own musculoskeletal health and mental well-being. And last but not least, we are really delighted that we have Dr. Dale Webb, who will be sharing a case study from the Mental Health and Axial Spa Society with us today, and we will close with a panel question and answer time allowed. The scale of the MSK burden, I think we're all familiar with the scale of the problem, and we know that we have approximately a third of people within the UK. The Global Burden of Disease study of 2016 indicated that MSK conditions are the leading cause of years lived with disability, and MSK is the third largest cause of disability-adjusted life years in the UK today. We also know from the study that it affects over 18.5 million people in the UK, of which 8.5 million approximately have osteoarthritis, and this figure is expected to rise to 17 million within the next 10 years. We also know that musculoskeletal health and people with an MSK condition will have an associated comorbidity, with large numbers having either depression or obesity. From the data that we have around work and employment, about 28.5 million working days are lost each year due to an MSK condition, and it's the biggest cause of physical disability. That number is pre-COVID, and I'm sure when we see the data post-COVID, that number will probably have significantly increased. I'm not going to go into too much detail around the work that Public Health England have directly done on MSK health and mental well-being, but I'm going to hand over now to Brendan to talk about his research and the work that he's been involved in globally and locally as well. So over to you, Brendan.
Thank you again for the kind invitation, and it's a great time to be talking about mental health. I know it's Mental Health Awareness Week this week. for those of us in mental health and outside of mental health care services, every week is mental health sort of awareness week. So really today I'm very, my slides won't change. Okay. I wanted to go over just 3 key objectives, just to give a bit of an oversight about mental health and why it's important. I know that was covered in introduction, but then get on with the crux of why people with musculoskeletal conditions and maybe a greatly increased risk of mental health care burden, and how this combined combination can be particularly problematic, and then really look at what could some of the solutions be in and around that. Just also to acknowledge that I've been guidelines sort of managing mental health and mental and physical health generally, and I'm funded by the NIHR part-time, which is the NHS. So just setting the scene, so obviously mental health is all of our business. Times are incredibly strange and difficult for all of us at this present moment in time. But at any one given time, 1 in 4 of us will experience a common mental health care condition at one point in time, and this will vary due to circumstances. Mental health conditions are very heterogeneous, and different clusters can happen. Often there's a point prevalence. Some of the more common mental health conditions, anxiety, 10% of people, and all mental illnesses can of course be serious, but what we tend to call, and quote, serious mental illnesses includes schizophrenia, bipolar, affects sort of around 1 to 3% of the population. Of course, as was outlined earlier on in the talk, look at global burden of disease or reasons why PHE go and help. Musculoskeletal disorders is up there, but depression is now one of the leading causes in this country and other countries of why people go and seek help for their health and well-being. And of course, this, which I'm going to go through today, are particularly poignant with unique challenges which we're going through at this moment. So clearly, reasons why people with arthritis and other musculoskeletal conditions are at risk of mental health comorbidity are complex and multifactorial. I'm just going to run through research that we and others try and understand this, outline the reasons why. Obviously, one of the primary symptoms of a musculoskeletal condition or disorder is pain. So we looked at data here from almost 240,000 people who understand is the relationship between depression and the report of pain. And essentially what this figure is showing, that when you look at reporting pain in people with depression, there is much higher levels of reported pain in people without depression. So can you see this really important matching between being depressed and having elevated levels of pain. So pain is a key factor for developing mental health comorbidity. But it can also be more sinister than depression, and there's a clear relationship between ongoing, particularly longer term, and increased feeling of not wanting to live, carry on anymore, and also to actively trying to end one's life. This was a paper which published a few years ago now, showing that when you look at people with various different painful comorbidity, predominantly musculoskeletal conditions, this is a patient which is greatly increased risk of feeling suicidal, reporting to attempt suicide, and various other forms. So it's a really key risk factor which we're concerned about in terms of pain. Again, very poignant for the time that we're in at the moment, that social isolation is a key risk factor for mental health comorbidity, and this is something which we did in some Euro data to look at people who had clinically diagnosed osteoarthritis, and found that people who had low osteoarthritis are much more likely to experience social isolation generally, and that this was an important factor which predisposed people with osteoarthritis to having increased mental health comorbidity. And for musculoskeletal conditions and pain, sleep or a lack of is a really important risk factor for increased mental comorbidity and also increased pain symptoms. Disturbed sleep is common in pain, and again, this in its own right is a key risk factor for numerous other mental health conditions as well. So this is another key factor which could contribute to increased mental health comorbidity, and that is just a plot sharing some data across various different countries where we've looked at this issue. And if we look at people with lower limb arthritis, this was something that we published with a colleague again about 4 years ago now. We just looked at people with osteoarthritis, and we found that around 1 in 5 people at any one time had either depression and or anxiety. So 1 in 5 people. When we consider all of the aforementioned, the pain symptoms, the social isolation, the potential sleep disturbances, it's right for this increased mental health morbidity. And again, if we look at another common musculoskeletal condition such as back pain, we looked at this and there was a strong relationship between having back pain, particularly long-term back pain, and increased risk of various mental health symptoms such as depressive episodes, psychosis, anxiety, increased stress sensitivity as well. So clearly is an issue, and again, just to emphasize our point, if we look at people with arthritis, again, this is data, so we've got reason to believe it's relatively representative. It's not a small study in South London to show that consistently when you look at people with arthritis, there is an elevated mental health comorbidity. So why is it important? Well, I could fill the rest of the time saying why this is important, but there are really many important reasons. And again, we looked across 6 European cohorts, and we found that when pain is evident in people with osteoarthritis, this really impacts people's mental health, and this fluctuates over time and negatively impacts people's quality of life and to function in their daily life. So co-occurring, this is a really important issue. Now, getting on to sort of some solutions, what we do going forwards. Now, being a physiotherapist, I'm going to look at the sort of non-pharmacological approaches with evidence-based for both the treatment and management of mental health comorbidity, but also in the context of musculoskeletal disorders. And intelligent people have been saying just how important activity is for our well-being and mental health and physical health for a really long period of time. And this is particularly true for people with musculoskeletal conditions and also mental health conditions and co-occurring together. And of interest, we published this paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2018, and essentially we wanted to do something very simple in generalization. We wanted to try and understand, for people who are free from depression at baseline, is there any relationship between how active you are in your daily life and your risk of developing depression in the future, when we follow people up for an average of 7.5 years. And over 260,000 people we identified where physical activity was measured. They were free from depression at baseline, and then they were followed over this time period across all geographical continents. We looked at young people, working age and older age, and we consistently found that there was a reduced risk of developing depression for people who are most active compared to least active of around 15%, even when you adjusted for other factors known to be associated with the increased risk of depression, such as age, socio-demographic status, physical healthcare conditions. But this was most potent when people met sort of Public Health England, the World Health Organization, physical activity guideline, doing 150 minutes of moderate rigorous physical activity over the course of the week, where there was around a 30% reduced risk of developing depression in the future. There's been some genetic data recently using Mendelian randomization studies from the UK Biobank confirming there is a causal relationship between how active you are and your risk of developing depression in the future. So movement is really important for managing musculoskeletal conditions, but also in terms of protecting against depression. We've done a similar thing in anxiety, but I've not presented the data here today. So very poignant for the times that we're in at the moment, but essentially the randomised control trial looking at PHQ-9 or depressive symptom score for people in their early 20s who are free from any mental or physical health comorbidity, and the intervention was kind of like what we're experiencing now. People, instead of having an intervention such as a medication or psychological therapy or an exercise program, people were advised or told to sit still, do not move, sedentary, and the control group carried on as usual. And this measured depressive symptoms at baseline. Week 2 is after 1 week, and week 3 is after the intervention stopped. And the intervention group is in orange on this slide, and you can see this spike in depressive symptoms scores compared to the control group, indicating enforced sedentary behaviour on people. This is not very good for our mental health, which confirms the longitudinal data I presented previously. So I hope it illustrated that movement is very important for our mental health. I've not gone much into the musculoskeletal disorder side of management, but there's robust evidence around that, and I don't need to remind people of that. In the context of, say, we'll take one treatment, depression, is we know that antidepressant medication can have small to moderate effect sizes. This can also help with some pain symptoms, and people with co-occurring musculoskeletal disorders. Psychological therapy is again really important, particularly behavioural activation, where we're getting people moving and doing activities which are enjoying to them, but lifestyle evidence is really accumulating. So briefly, we looked at the studies that had been published looking at structured exercise for people with and without chronic conditions when you compare exercise versus a control or treatment as usual. And essentially what we found is that exercise over a 12 to 16 week period had a significant and a clinically meaningful reduction in people's depressive symptoms over a relatively short period of time, over and above usual care. And one of the fair criticisms of exercise as an intervention for managing depression in this context is the trials have been relatively short term in follow-up, often less than 6 months, include relatively few numbers of participants, often less than 100. But there was a great study done in Sweden where they recruited over 900 people in 3 arms, all had depressive symptoms. One group of over 300 people in treatment as usual. The other 2 groups did too. Another group had CBT delivered via the internet to help with their depressive symptoms, and the other group had structured clinical exercise. And what they found is that broadly exercise was as effective as CBT, which is commonly recommended, again, and fantastic for people, but both were more effective than treatment as usual, and there was no difference between CBT and exercise. Both had the same level of improvement. Most of the evidence has focused on aerobic exercise or movement to help people get their heart up a little, heart and lungs working a bit harder, but there is increasing evidence that when we work on getting our muscles stronger against any weights or using our own body weight, that this can have a meaningful reduction in depressive symptoms for people with and without chronic conditions, including those with musculoskeletal conditions going forwards. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail, I'm aware of the time, but here is a nice overview done by Garcia looking at everything that's ever been published on exercise for the management of lots of different mental health conditions, demonstrating this consistency across whether it's children, adults or older adults, that exercise is and physical activity, such as increasing movement, is for anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, and more serious mental health conditions such as schizophrenia. The mechanisms for this are complex and multifactorial, and there are some biological mechanisms which may account for this. Again, this is a paper by Aaron Candola in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews, but there are many psychosocial mechanisms which contribute as well, such as feeling of self-esteem, achieving goals, having a sense of social support, which also contribute to the feel-good factor of engaging in exercise and contribute to the antidepressant effect. Just very quickly wrapping up, some good tips and resources that I found is the Moving Medicine resource, which is very, very useful, which is available. You can have a 1-minute conversation for somebody who's presenting with depression or another mental health condition around increasing physical activity. You can have a 5-minute conversation or a more minute conversation. And this is based on the motivational interviewing framework. I really like this particular sort of summary and slide for winning ways to wellbeing. I think this is really important, particularly in the time that we're in at the moment, about talking. It's really important to connect, to sort of give, take notice, keep learning and be more active to help promote our wellbeing as we go forwards. So wrapping up for this very quick overview, hopefully illustrated that mental health, regardless if we do or don't have a musculoskeletal condition, is all our business. Really, mind and body cannot be separated, and there's many reasons why people with musculoskeletal conditions are at increased risk of various mental health comorbidities. Today I've really focused on depression and a little bit of anxiety, but it's important. Physical activity and helping people find meaningful movements which are important could be a really good quick win to help people manage their musculoskeletal condition, the fatigue, the other symptoms, and also manage their mental health. There's very good evidence, as you all know, that movement and exercise is very good for managing musculoskeletal conditions. So good evidence in managing of mental health conditions. I think I will leave it there. And
yeah, while that's loading, and we see if it does. Well, everybody, I am Louis Allwood. I'm Policy and Public Affairs Lead at Centre for Mental Health. A happy Mental Health Awareness Week to you all. And there we go. Slides should be visible. Perhaps confusingly, I'm bringing two perspectives today. One from Centre for Mental Health. We are an independent research charity, and another from EqualWell UK, which is a collaborative movement of physical and mental health charities, arm's length bodies of the Department of Health, NHS and independent service providers, and others. Together we're committed to the shared endeavour of lowering the mortality gap for people with severe mental illness, by which we mean psychosis, borderline personality disorders, and so on, who on average live around 15 to 20 years than the rest of us. So Equally Well is a concept from New Zealand. It's hosted by Centre for Mental Health in partnership with Rethink Mental Illness, who facilitate our Experts by Experience group, and also in partnership with the Royal Colleges of Psychiatrists and GPs, who manage our clinical advisory group. Through this co-produced approach, everything we do as Equally Well is a partnership between people with lived experience and people with professional experience, with the principle of nothing about me without me there at every stage of the work. We've got a growing membership of organisations working with us, and we're sharing learning to close that gap for people with lived experience. So this is what the gap looks like across the piece. These statistics are always a bit of a shock to read, and now the reason that we set Equally Well up in the UK. I think my connection wasn't great, but I believe we've heard quite a lot of detail in the previous presentation around the link between musculoskeletal disorders and mental health. Some statistics that could be added here. Depression is really common for people with arthritis, more common in the general population. Around a third of women with arthritis have comorbid depression, and at least 20% of men. This is probably the place to make the disclaimer that the Centre and Equally Well haven't conducted much research of our own on musculoskeletal health, but all of our work is informed by this understanding of intersectionality between long-term conditions and mental health problems. It was with this that we were supported by NHS England and Improvement to create a resource to help people with severe mental illness look after their physical health during the pandemic. And there is absolutely transferable learning from that, which I'll share. So before I go on, I just want to touch briefly on the mental health spectrum. Just like physical health, we all have mental health. Each of us at any time, anywhere, from healthy to coping to struggling or unwell. In a sense, many of the things that bolster or support our mental health, moving it towards the green, are the same whether we have long-term conditions, mental health diagnoses, or neither. What does change is the complexity of our experiences and differences in the accessibility of things which improve mental health. We know that the pandemic is making some of these areas more difficult, especially for people with long conditions, and that informed our development of the resource. Hopefully this is a useful graphic demonstrating the overlap between long-term conditions and mental health problems. Some 4.6 million people in the UK have both a mental health problem and a long-term condition. If this was overlaying long-term conditions with severe mental illnesses, the overlap would be much bigger. So as mental health problems become more severe, so does the likelihood that person has physical health. So through Equally Well, we're unpicking this bio relationship where a person with a long-term condition may face stresses, difficulties with their well-being related to that condition, and people with mental health problems, particularly severe mental illnesses, may have more difficulty than others looking after physical health and specifically managing health conditions. It's really easy to see how, without the right support, people with both mental and physical problems can experience a harmful cycle. That's exactly what we hear from service users. It's what we do. So I'll give you some brief background. Our resource for people with severe mental illness. I'll share a link to that at the end of this session. So we were in conversation with NHS England about the gap in evidence and the lack of guides about managing physical health for people with severe mental illness. We know this is a big issue at the moment. A recent survey, Rethink, found that 80% of people with severe mental illnesses were reporting that COVID-19 was making their mental health worse. So with support from NHS England, we carried out a scoping exercise to identify existing resources, bring them all together, speak to people living with mental illnesses, speak to professionals from a range of disciplines, and we brought these key themes together in a guide to be factual and helpful. And here we have them. And as you can see, they're very much factors which would influence anybody's mental and mental health. So COVID-19 is a respiratory virus which affects the lungs and airways. Smoking is obviously an important issue. This is twice as common for adults with serious mental illnesses, and it can have serious repercussions for the management of their mental health, including by affecting the efficiency of their medication, as well as obviously links to physical health problems. For those who want to quit smoking, lockdown presents additional problems around anxiety and inactivity. We found from speaking to people that supportive factors could be really important and helpful, involving their personal networks, engaging their GPs and their healthcare workers in what they wanted to do, particularly around their medication. Other key messages were around being aware of changes in appetite and being realistic and kind to oneself. So thinking of challenges as slip-ups rather than failures. We heard that healthy eating was challenging, where a lot of shops don't stock healthy foods, and attempts to go further afield to join a big queue at the local big supermarket could be stressful, exhausting, and overwhelming. One person describes that they could order fast food deliveries so much more easily and quicker than being able to shop and stock their cupboards with healthy foods. We also heard about the struggles people face with emotional and disordered eating, and how the situation with COVID-19 is making those situations harder too. Keeping a balanced diet is really important for our physical and our mental health, so we shared some information and advice on this in our guidance document. We have also, in the last couple of weeks, secured confirmation from the Department of Health and Social Care that the NHS Volunteer Responder Scheme is open for people with mental health problems who are unable to leave to go shopping. They can self-refer the helpline or the app to have NHS volunteers support them by bringing them essential supplies, including prescriptions, including food. They can also be referred to this by healthcare workers, so please do bear this in mind, and I'll share a link to that at the end. Many people with severe mental illness have a physical health condition that means they need to self-isolate or shield. So how they can keep active was a key point that was raised in nearly all of the conversations that we had. Most people shared that online fitness videos weren't accessible if they had a physical health condition or a severe mental illness. And in our research, we found that one of the largest barriers was having these high expectations. And when one doesn't meet those goals set, they can feel like a failure. So the key message we shared in our resource was around setting realistic goals and starting small. This is also tied to healthy eating, of course, and we shared some resource for keeping active inside for those who can't leave home and don't have a garden. We share some resources for those in our guide too. Tied to both the previous slides is healthy weight management. One person described their experience as snakes and ladders. Doing loads of good work on diet and exercise before the pandemic, but have been totally derailed by the new situation, and that felt like it sent them back down the board, spiralling back down a snake, back down the board. But we found that people still could get help remotely from the practitioners who are already in their lives, their physios, this quote, other healthcare workers, from friends and from families. So staying connected is really important, working with other people to create plans or schedules and to try different physical activities until they find what works for them. So although medication and financial wellbeing aren't obvious themes for our resource, these were topics which were raised in nearly every conversation we had and in key pieces of research. Some underlying evidence, some people weren't contacting their GPs, especially around medication, and some people even thinking about coming off their medication, or others buying from unreliable websites assumed they wouldn't be able to get access to their usual prescriptions through the usual channels during a health crisis. The message that, though it's working differently, their services are open for business and should be contacted when people need them is really important to get out there, and we all have a role in doing that. Dangers from COVID-19 are also a major concern for people who are already feeling vulnerable. In our guide, we talk about the symptoms, give advice to people about what to do when they get it, and also what recovering from it might be like. We found a helpful resource from Bipolar UK, which was about working with healthcare practitioners to produce a holistic advanced statement, recording wishes and needs of your own for when you become unwell. This would include things like key contacts, vital information on medication, and other elements of a person's diagnosis. While not a legally binding document, this could help whatever professionals might be treating somebody for COVID-19 to provide the right care around that person, taking all of their needs into account. It was also important to share the after effects of COVID-19 to show that people have recovered and how they can maintain their health through stopping smoking, through the guidance there, moving to a healthy diet, and building up that immune system. We included a number of helpful links to other organisations and other resources in the document too. So before I share that document, and I can also copy and paste the link into the chat, we always share crisis contacts, so NHS Samaritans and so on, still working. Several services have expanded their capacity and opening hours so they can reach more people at this time. And I recommend Helplines Partnership as well. It's got great information through that link there on a range of different specialist helplines. So thank you very much. I will try and copy this paste into the chat on this webinar, And if you think your organisation might be interested in Equally Well, please contact through the details below. We are looking for more people to collaborate, more organisations, especially those working in different areas of physical health, which are more important for people with, or especially important for people with mental illness. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lewis. That was extremely powerful in terms of the work that you're currently doing around COVID, which is very relevant for all of us going forward. I'd like to invite Laura to come on board and present the research that you've collated over the last couple of months from patients and public that have been contacting versus arthritis during the lockdown in terms of their musculoskeletal health and things that they're saying and that they're seeking from us. So Laura, over to you.
So thank you very much, everybody. I'm really delighted to be able to just give you a very short presentation from Versus Arthritis in terms of the work that we've been doing in listening to people with arthritis during the pandemic so far. And it's just a very short slide set. So if we can go on to the next slide, Samir.
Yep.
Super. So I just wanted to reflect a bit on, not to repeat what Brendan and Louis have said, but just to talk a bit about what the impact of COVID-19 will be on the musculoskeletal health of the population. And we can envisage at the moment that it will affect people in a number of different ways. So people who have had severe COVID infection will have some musculoskeletal symptoms, including muscle weakness. We know this is the case with other respiratory diseases, and we're beginning to see that already. So we will need to think about things like our physiotherapy services and our other rehabilitation services to protect those people who have been directly affected by the virus. But alongside that, there are some much wider population health issues around COVID. And we've heard already, the impact of people working from home is causing musculoskeletal problems. So there's some beautiful work that's come out already from the Institute of Employment Studies in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, showing an increase in neck and shoulder pain, and it's not hard to imagine that that's people working from home in spaces that haven't been designed for the kind of work that people are doing and caring and supporting children at the same time, and that's having an impact. There's then the impact of the lockdown restrictions on the overall physical activity of the population, and I think, to be really honest, the verdict is a bit out on this, because in those early weeks of lockdown in England, we knew that physical activity was restricted, but we also saw bits of the population who hadn't been very active before out doing once a day daily exercise, and certainly now walking and cycling more. And actually there are some potential gains for musculoskeletal health, as well as that initial problem of the lockdown and the reduction. We know definitely that that we have to look out for are those people, as Louis said, who are shielding and isolating because they're particularly vulnerable, and we can predict that those people will be less active. We know with a bit of a longer lens, our long-standing work with PHE and others, that people with musculoskeletal pain, just as previous have said, already face barriers to being physically active and will struggle to do exercise. And for those people, the pandemic is another layer on top of that. And we need to find ways, as the rest of society becomes active and returns to something, whatever I'm not going to say the new normal, but whatever the future looks like, we have to find a way of integrating those people into the plans that we make to support those people who would have been challenged anyway. So just very quickly, what is Versus Arthritis doing? At this point in time, we are turning into a charity that's listening, and we are very much providing information and support to people. And we have seen in this early part of the pandemic a massive increase in people phoning us, people using our online services, people really looking for information and support. So my two slides are just a bit of a snapshot of what we've been hearing so far. So the next slide, if you can advance it, Samir, is the Campaigns Network. So this is a group about 12,000 campaigners that up through our work before the pandemic, particularly some work that we were doing around access to joint replacement surgery and the delays that people were facing. Obviously, we had to pause that work because it wasn't appropriate to do in the time of the pandemic. But we wanted to re-engage the community, and we went out to them at the start of the pandemic, and this is a snapshot of what they've told us in this of April, and it's drawn from about 4,000 responses. It's by no means representative of the whole MSK population, but it's a really good barometer of what people are telling us. And the things that they're coming up with, you can see on the right-hand side, really practical things around shopping and getting access to the things that people need. The health-related things in terms of appointments being cancelled, queries around medication and self-isolating, and a need for accurate advice and guidance. But also really high up that list is this impact on mental health. And we knew that already people with MSK conditions before the pandemic would report feeling lonely and isolated because of the pain and the limited mobility these conditions. And so it's no great surprise to us to hear that during this time they are experiencing that to an even greater degree. And you can see some of the other topics that people have talked about, the challenges of work, the challenges of caring, the impacts of social care changes, and the impacts of changing access to health services. So that's one channel that we've used to listen. And if we could have the next slide, Samir, please. We also are listening through a number of different channels. So I've talked a bit about our helpline, but we have 2 online assistants that work 24/7, our virtual assistants. Ava is the general arthritis assistant, and Ava was to help people during the pandemic. They've been really well used. We have our online community, which is a peer-to-peer virtual support network for people, and we have a dedicated listening panel where we talk to people with these conditions. And you can see on the right, these findings are from a bit earlier than the previous slide, so the early weeks of the pandemic, and the kind of topics people are talking about. So understanding and how to stay safe and the impacts of how the government's guide you. All the questions around healthcare, how to get appointments, how to get medication, how to stay both physically and mentally well. Now, increasingly, the challenges of employment and work, going back to work, people at high risk being required to go back to work, the implications of living with family or children, particularly who are vulnerable. Lots and lots of questions about isolation and social distancing and what's appropriate or not, particularly if you feel that you're at high risk. And underpinning all of this, a narrative around pain and a sense that even though online communication might have increased, in this time of anxiety and concern, pain becomes more an issue at the forefront of people's minds. So just very quickly, I hope that gives you a snapshot of what the community of people that we can hear is saying. What are we doing about it? We're very active. We have put together an initial assessment of the public health impacts of COVID on people with arthritis. That's available on this link and on our website. We would really welcome input from others and challenge on what we've said there to help us respond and to develop our policy better. But the one thing we are absolutely determined to do is to make sure that the voices of people, including children with arthritis, are not forgotten in the recovery planning and in the weeks and months ahead. So that's where we are, and I hope that's a helpful contribution to today.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. It's really, really critical and very timely information that that we can utilise in terms of our planning and support for the population that we're serving. I'm going to invite Dale to share with us a case study from Mental Health and Axial Spondylitis Arthritis Society. Over to you, Dale. I believe there are no slides for this presentation.
That's right, and there's slides. So just checking you can all hear me, okay?
I can hear you. Can others hear Dale?
Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, Dale.
So I'll just briefly set some context for the condition, and then I'll tell you the story about a woman called Tracy. So axial spondyloarthritis, or axial SPA for short, is a form of inflammatory arthritis that mainly affects the spine but also other joints. And people live with daily stiffness and high levels of fatigue, and the average age of symptom onset is just 24 years. It's managed through medication to reduce inflammation and regular exercise, but it lasts a lifetime and is characterized by regular flare-ups. Symptom onset is very gradual, and often symptoms are misunderstood as having a mechanical or a psychosomatic cause. The average time to diagnosis in the UK is 8.5 years, by which time irreversible damage to the spine may have occurred. And during this time, people live with large amounts of uncertainty, anxiety, and pain. People with axial SPA often have poor emotional well-being because they experience fatigue, social isolation, guilt, concerns about their body image, and anxieties about having flares. And the last thing I'll say by way of introduction is that prevalent studies indicate that up to 59% of people with axial SPA have depression, which is higher than other MSK conditions. And we suspect there's a large burden of disease where care is suboptimal. So on to Tracy. Tracy is in her 40s. She lives with her partner and her partner's children. She was diagnosed with depression and anxiety 12 years ago after the death of her father and experiences panic attacks. She was diagnosed with axial SPA 6 years ago, and she feels strongly that her anxiety and low mood has become more frequent since her axial SPA diagnosis. Now, Tracy's passion was playing rugby. This was a huge part of her life, the social networks that she formed, the love of the game itself, and as someone who struggled with her weight, it meant that she could keep on top of that by having twice weekly training and matches on weekends. But increasingly she became very stiff and sore after her training and matches and realised that she needed to give up the game. And a year after her symptom onset, which is quite quick in our case, she was referred to rheumatology and diagnosed with axial SPA. And during that time of pre-diagnosis, was very anxious and worried about what the rheumatologist was going to say, what her future might look like. She was just given a leaflet and really had to do her own research, but the more she read about the condition, the more that things clicked into place, that her symptoms actually weren't mechanical, they weren't because of the rugby, they were something different. Now, since her diagnosis, she has experienced a lot of pain and fatigue and very poor sleep, which is typical for people with axial SPA. She said to me, it's so draining when you're constantly trying to do things, but you just don't have the energy to do it. She tried to carry on with her job. Her employer did make efforts to adapt her working environment, but ultimately the effort that was required just to do basic things at work was too great for her, and she started to feel very guilty. She worked for a small company. She felt that others in the team were having to shoulder the work that she could no longer do. And she said to me, I just felt useless. So that was the tipping point for her then giving up her job. Because she stopped playing rugby, she gained a lot of weight. And so she wasn't doing much activity at all. And she, again, her self-esteem declined significantly. When I asked her about the management of her condition and both her axial SPA and her low mood, what she said was that in rheumatology, nobody ever asked her about her mood. They focused on her pain, but never once just asked her how she was. Likewise, she was never asked about her fatigue levels within rheumatology. And within general practice, whilst she felt that her GP had been appreciative of her low mood and said that she could self-refer for psychological support, actually what she desperately wanted was a more interventionist approach from her GP and rheumatologist to provide mental health support and to give a reassurance that the mental health support she would get would understand her axial SPA condition. Well, how has lockdown affected her? In some ways, not a great deal. She goes for walks each day. She is anxious around social situations, so being at home more has been good in some ways. It's also meant that she's missed out on her regular walks with her brother, which she saw as being her regular therapy. Also, she had just heard about the NAS branches that we run across the country that can provide weekly physiotherapy and hydrotherapy. She was just about to join her first group to get weekly exercise, but of course the lockdown has put paid to that. And then finally, she was just due to have surgery for a gastric band, which she felt would have a big impact on her long-term physical and emotional well-being. But of course, due to the lockdown, the surgery has been cancelled, and she now feels it's back to square one. Having put on so much weight, she feels embarrassed and she feels very negatively about herself. So that's the end of that case study, Nuzhat.
Thank you very much indeed. That, gives us a little glimpse really into the condition and how people are managing, and the extent of the support that we're not really providing, but we need to think really carefully in terms of the lockdown, how that actually is going to impact this particular population group. I've just received a message a few minutes back from our IT that we might go into outage for a few minutes. So if we do, I apologize, but I'm going to open up for questions. So if you have any questions, then please type them into the messaging, and we will be able to respond back to you either right now if we can get the questions in time before the outage. Alternatively, we are very happy to receive questions via email, and we can get responses back from our speakers through the K-Hub. But I would like to say thank you to all our speakers. It's been absolutely brilliant to actually, we wanted to do this webinar at the start of May, and then we postponed it, but we felt that it was really critical and important to hold this webinar and really sort of bring to the fore the very intrinsic connection and the link between physical and mental well-being.